Hi girls, welcome back to another wonderful week of Farby and 10. As we're approaching the big day of Chaf Shvat, the yahrzeit of Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka, I wanted to share with you a reflection moment that when I was in second grade, it was 7 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden, from my sleep, I hear the siren, the Shabbos alarm. And I remember thinking to myself, it's definitely not Shabbos. And so I went to my father and I said, what's this Shabbos alarm about? And he turned to me and sadly said that Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka passed away. And to be honest, I didn't really know much about Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka. And it was only till I started to get older and started reading a little bit more about her. And even to the extent of when I got married and started to really appreciate the Rebbetzin and her sacrifice, how she shared the Rebbe with us. And she just gave up her life and so much of her marriage so that we can have the Rebbe. So I wanted to share with you some stories that I found very touching, and hopefully you can gain from them as well. So number one, her activism. Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka was, when she was younger, her and her sister were asked by the Frierdiker Rebbe to go help in a yeshiva and go during curfew hours, late in the night during communist Russia, really risking their life, bringing over food, bringing over candles. And she knew that this was real sacrifice because she was actually risking her life, but she knew that when the job had to get done, she was going to get it done. And as a matter of fact, a few years later, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested and taken to exile, it was the Frierdiker Rebbe that asked Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka to come along with him. And he actually gave her over all of the accounts and all of the paperwork so that she can officially be in charge of all of the underground work in Russia, keeping Yiddishkeit alive. And look where she came. She came so far that look at Jewish life today in Russia, thanks to the Frierdiker Rebbe and thanks to Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka. So when I reflect on the Rebbetzin and I think about her sacrifice and her activism in communal work, I think to myself that no, she wasn't a very outgoing person necessarily. She wasn't very loud and boisterous. And sometimes we might think to ourselves, I'm not that loud GO type of girl to arrange for bring-ins and arrange GO activities. But every single one of us has a part of the Rebbetzin inside of us. Every single one of us has that part where Hashem gave us gifts and talents. And even if it's in our subtle, quieter way, but look how much she accomplished. Number two, she was the Rebbe's biggest Hasid. Here was a woman who came from such royalty. She was the daughter of the Frierdiker Rebbe. She was the wife of the Rebbe. And what gave her so much nachas was being the Hasid of the Rebbe. As a matter of fact, after Yud Shvat, for a full year, Hasidim were begging the Rebbe to become the Nasi. And he kept refusing. And it was really thanks to Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka that turned to the Rebbe with her subtlety, her sensitivity, and her Bina Yesera. And very, in a strong sense, but in a very subtle way, turned to the Rebbe and said that if you don't take upon yourself the leadership, then all the work of my father is going to be in vain. All the work of all the previous Rebbeim would be in vain. And she was ultimately the one who encouraged the Rebbe to take upon himself the Nasias and usher in the Dar HaShvi'i. There was an incident once where Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka was once walking in the streets of Manhattan, and two Bachrim stopped her. They didn't know it was Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka. And they asked her if she was Jewish. And she smiled to them, and in her very shy yet at the same time very modest way, she didn't want to say who she was, and that would embarrass the two Bachrim. So she smiles to them, and with a little twinkle in her eye, she says, "My husband would be so proud of you." And it was only later that the two boys realized who this woman was that they approached. And I think when it comes to our lives, and we think about the Hasid that Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka was, let us stop for a moment and say, this would bring so much nachas to the Rebbe, the miftzayim that the boys were doing. This will bring so much joy to my husband. So the next time we go shopping, maybe I can add a little bit of neshek in my pocketbook so that I can stop and find that one Jew that can use my help. Or maybe On a Sunday, I can go with friends on Miftzayim, and after that, treat ourselves out to some shopping. But how can I make the Rebbe proud, just like those boys who brought the Rebbe so much nachas in their Miftzayim? Number 3, her Avas Yisrael. It was known that the Rebbetzin had so much sensitivity and so much care for other people, and she did it in such a subtle way. One time, someone saw the Rebbetzin banging al chet, and he turned to her and he said, "Rebbetzin, why are you banging al chet? What did you do wrong?" And she stopped and she said as follows: "When I was in France, there were bombs that were flying overhead. It was during the wartime. And I saw a particular bomb that was coming overhead, and I saw an elderly man standing right in that position where the bomb was going to fall onto. And so I pushed this elderly Jew to the floor, ultimately saving his life. And even though I saved his life, I pushed a Jew to the ground." Look at the sensitivity and the Avos Yisrael that Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka had. Think about it when we're in school, when we're with a group of friends and we're talking, and all of a sudden another girl walks into the circle, maybe not our best of friend, and the circle becomes quiet and the conversation becomes silence. How awkward does that girl feel? How uncomfortable does she feel? Let us stop for a moment and think to ourselves, how can I go out of my way to help another classmate, to help another friend, or maybe not such a friend who can use my help? Maybe study with her, maybe go out with her. Look at the sensitivity that the Rebbetzin had for another Jew, and how can I have sensitivity towards my classmates? And number 4, Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka was very careful with her style, and she was a very stylish woman, and yet at the same time, very careful with her modest dress. So Dini Garari, yes, you might have heard of her from Parshas. She shares a story how her family was very close to the Rebbetzin, and quite often they would go to the Rebbetzin house for a visit. It was one time when she was in 9th grade, a teenager, in high school, and her family was going to the Rebbetzin house. So she dressed up in her fancy clothing, her fancy attire, ready to walk into the palace. And she says the moment the Rebbetzin opened the door for her family, the Rebbetzin looked at her and smiled and complimented her and said, "You look so stylish, you look so edel and sneas." Wow. The Rebbetzin was very stylish. She lived in Paris, she lived in New York, cities of style and city of class. But the Rebbetzin also knew that for a teenager, you should look stylish and you should look cute and you should look trendy. And it's not a contradiction to be modest, to be tznius. So l'chaim to every single one of us as we approach the big day of Chaf Shvat. We have so much to learn from the Rebbetzin and so much to emulate in her life. Her Avas Yisrael, to be more sensitive towards another girl. Her activism, even though she wasn't the loudest person, but she did so much in her own quiet way and made such a huge impact and such a huge difference. The tznius that she imparted in us is to remind us that you could be cute, you could be trendy, and at the same time, you could still be tznius. And to remind ourselves that when we go out with our friends, add a little bit of mitzvahim in our lives, make the Rebbe proud, touch another Jew, so that we could ultimately be reunited, that by this Chaf Shvat, we will get to see Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka live in Yerushalayim.